So let's talk about beta coefficients. I know we've been referring to the coefficients as betas, but these are a little bit different. This is going to be kind of a modeling technique we might want to use sometimes if kind of the scale of the variable is a little bit different or it's hard to interpret. So let's kind of expand on that thought and kind of introduce why we might want to use it. Then we'll go kind of through some of the algebra of how we derive the interpretation of beta coefficients, and we'll look at an example. So sometimes a variable of interest is measured in a way or in a scale that is difficult to interpret. That is difficult to interpret. And so, for example, we might be a final score, so it might be what your final exam is out of. Let's say it's out of like 80 points or 86 points. That might make it hard to think about what would happen if your final grade went up by 1 mark. What does that mean? We often want to use these when it comes to standardized tests as well. Because again, they're kind of measured sometimes on a kind of a different scale or a hard to interpret scale. So like the SATs out of a certain number, the ACTs out of a certain number. And we might want to think of a different way of interpreting variables that are measured this way. Let's kind of expand on those examples, and we'll just use a different color for that. For example, that's supposed to say for, not fox. For example, usually we are interested in how an individual test score relates to others. So we're not usually interested in maybe the absolute number of a test score, a standardized test, but we're kind of interested in what this person's like maybe relative ranking or relative score, how that may impact, let's say, wages or something like that. So let's kind of, again, expand on this point and maybe hopefully make it a little bit more clear. So if we're interested in the effect of an SAT score on wages, we're not really usually interested in what happens to someone's wages if their SAT score went up by 1 point. Instead, it might be, we might want to instead think about what happens if this person's relative score changed, like their score went up by 1 standard deviation, for instance. It makes more sense to think about what would happen if the score increased by 1, I'm going to say SD for standard deviation. So if their score increased by 1 standard deviation, rather than what happens, I believe it's still on the board here, if the score increased by 1 point. So this is kind of in these situations where the scale is different. So an example we're going to look at is, maybe nitrous oxide is measured in parts per million. Well, maybe it doesn't make much sense to think about what happens if the parts per million go up by a marginal amount, but instead what happens if the kind of nitrous oxide or the gas increases, the concentration, I should say, increases by 1 standard deviation. So that's that's when we're going to want to use these beta coefficients. So now let's look at, let's kind of do some algebra and talk about the interpretation or how we kind of come up with this idea of beta coefficients. And we'll look at an example.